The night he left, he made sure the door slammed hard enough to rattle the walls. He didn't look back, didn't hesitate, didn't even pretend there was unfinished business. He carried his clothes out in stiff black bags, confidence draped over his shoulders like armor. By morning, he'd already told people his version, that I was naive, bad with money, lucky he'd handled everything for as long as he did. I let him talk. Silence has always been underestimated. For weeks after he moved out, I lived in a strange pause. The house felt hollow, like it was waiting for instructions. I moved through rooms slowly, touching the edges of a life I wasn't ready to grieve yet. Drawers half opened, closets untouched, memories stacked where certainty used to live. I wasn't searching for answers, not consciously. One afternoon, while sorting coats in the hallway closet, my elbow brushed against the wall behind the old winter jackets. The sound was wrong, too solid, too deliberate. I pushed harder, and there it was, a steel square, flush with the drywall, a wall safe. My stomach tightened. He'd installed it years earlier. I remembered asking once what it was for. He'd laughed, casual, dismissive. Nothing important, he'd said, just paperwork. You worry too much. I'd believed him. I stared at the safe for a long moment, my heart beating louder than it should have. I hadn't known the code then, but arrogance leaves patterns. Birthdays, dates, numbers men think are clever. It took 3 tries. The door clicked open. Inside were folders, neatly labeled, flash drives, envelopes thick with documents, handwritten notes in his unmistakable handwriting, everything organized with care, like someone who believed they'd never be challenged. My hands began to tremble as I pulled the first folder out. Account statements I'd never seen before, joint investments I thought were empty, very much alive, transfers logged carefully, funds moved quietly, signatures that looked like mine but weren't, my name used like a tool, like permission. I sat down on the floor. The deeper I went, the worse it got. Hidden accounts, diverted funds, properties listed under shell names, notes tracking dates, amounts, contingencies. He hadn't been careless, he'd been meticulous. This wasn't panic spending, this wasn't mismanagement, this was strategy, years of it, built on the assumption that I would never look, never question, never understand. I felt sick, but not surprised. That realization hurt more than anything else. I didn't cry, not yet. I didn't scream. I didn't call him. I copied everything, page by page, drive by drive. I photographed, scanned, backed up, cloud storage, external hard drive, multiple copies. I moved with a calm I didn't recognize in myself. This wasn't a confrontation moment. This was a preparation moment. By the time the sun went down, the living room floor was covered in evidence. I sat in the middle of it all, breathing steadily, realizing something profound and terrifying at the same time. The man who thought he'd outsmarted me had documented his entire betrayal in one place, a place he'd never thought I'd open. I closed the safe quietly and put the coats back the way they were. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from him. You'll never be able to make sense of the finances. I handled all that. I stared at the screen, then set the phone face down. He had no idea. Not yet. But soon, the truth locked behind that steel door was going to step into the light, and when it did, it wouldn't need my voice to be loud. It would speak for itself. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that felt unfamiliar. Not peace, not relief, just direction. The evidence was still spread across the living room floor, exactly where I'd left it. For a moment, I stood there barefoot, coffee growing cold in my hand, looking down at years of lies laid out like a roadmap I'd never been meant to read. I half expected panic to hit me late, like delayed shock. It didn't. Instead, my mind went methodical. I separated the documents into piles: bank accounts, investments, properties, forged signatures. Each category got its own folder. I labeled everything carefully, the way someone does when they finally understand this isn't about emotion, it's about accuracy. Accuracy keeps you alive in rooms where feelings don't matter. By noon, I had scanned every page twice. I uploaded encrypted copies to 2 different cloud services. I saved duplicates to flash drives and sealed them in envelopes. One went into my purse, one went into a lockbox at my sister's house. I didn't tell her why, only that I needed it safe. She didn't ask questions. That afternoon, he called. I watched the phone ring until it stopped. Then he texted, "Have you figured out how much you're losing yet?" I exhaled slowly and set the phone down. This wasn't the time. I made an appointment with a lawyer the next day, quietly, under the name I'd kept long before marriage. When I walked into her office, I didn't bring my anger, I brought binders. She flipped through the first folder without speaking. Her expression shifted from neutral to focused. By the third folder, she stopped turning pages and looked directly at me. "Did you copy everything?" "Yes." "Multiple backups?" "Yes." She leaned back slightly. "Good, because this is extensive." That word again, extensive. She explained what I was looking at in legal language: financial manipulation, identity misuse, fraud patterns that didn't happen accidentally. She talked about forensic accountants, asset tracing, freezing accounts before money could disappear further. I listened carefully, took notes, asked questions that surprised even me. Not once did she ask why I hadn't confronted him. She already knew. When I left her office, the sun felt too bright. The world was still moving, people still living inside ordinary problems, unaware that my life had just tilted permanently. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, hands steady on the wheel. I wasn't scared of him anymore. I was scared of how long I'd trusted someone who believed he was smarter than consequences. At home, I opened the safe one last time. I checked that nothing was missing, then I photographed it exactly as it was: placement, contents, structure. Evidence doesn't just live on paper, it lives in context. That night, he showed up unannounced. He stood on the porch like he belonged there, confidence dialed back just enough to look reasonable. When I opened the door, he smiled like someone expecting confusion, weakness, apology. "You look tired," he said. "I'm busy," I replied. He stepped closer. "I'm just here to help you understand what's going on. You always struggled with the financial stuff." I met his eyes. For the first time, I didn't see the man I married. I saw someone who had mistaken silence for stupidity. "I understand enough," I said. He laughed lightly, dismissive. "You really don't." I stepped back and closed the door. That was the moment I knew. He still thought the safe was his secret, and because of that, he was about to make the worst mistake of his life, believing he had time, believing he was untouchable, believing I would eventually need him to explain what I already knew. I locked the door, leaned against it briefly, and allowed myself one slow breath. The process had begun, and the truth, every transaction, every forged line, every hidden move was already on its way to people who didn't care about charm, confidence, or excuses, people who only cared about proof. And I had plenty of that. Once the process started, everything moved faster than I expected, and slower at the same time. Days filled with emails, calls, and meetings that required a version of me I hadn't known existed. Calm, precise, unemotional. I learned quickly that truth doesn't need decoration, it needs structure. The forensic accountant came first. He sat across from me with a quiet intensity, scrolling through spreadsheets like they were stories written in numbers. He didn't ask how I felt. He asked when things started to feel off, when accounts stopped lining up, when explanations stopped making sense. I answered honestly. Years ago, I said. I just didn't know how to name it. He nodded like that answer confirmed something. That's common. That word again. Common. There was something unsettling about realizing how familiar my story was to professionals, how many people before me had trusted the wrong hands, how many had been told they were bad with money when the truth was they'd been deliberately kept in the dark. By the end of the week, the picture was undeniable. Funds siphoned gradually, assets hidden strategically, paper trails designed to confuse rather than disappear. He hadn't stolen recklessly, he'd stolen patiently. That patience would be his undoing. Meanwhile, he kept texting. Messages that swung between condescension and concern, offers to help, warnings about legal fees, thinly veiled threats wrapped in smiles. I didn't respond. Silence wasn't avoidance anymore, it was insulation. One afternoon, my lawyer called with urgency in her voice. "We're filing motions to freeze assets," she said, "but timing matters. Has he moved anything recently?" I thought of the safe, the meticulous notes, the dates that lined up with his confidence. "Yes," I said, "and I can prove it." That night, I barely slept, not from fear, but from adrenaline, the kind that arrives when you realize the ground under someone else's certainty is about to give way. The next morning, the filings went through. Accounts flagged, transactions paused, properties under review. I imagined him discovering it the same way I had, unexpectedly, through a statement that didn't make sense, a system that suddenly stopped responding the way it always had. The thought didn't bring me joy, it brought balance. He called repeatedly that afternoon. I let it ring. Then the texts came faster. "What did you do? Why are my accounts locked? This is a mistake." I read every message without replying. For the first time, confusion belonged to him. That evening, I sat alone at the dining table, reviewing copies of documents I already knew by heart. I wasn't checking for errors. I was grounding myself, reminding myself that this wasn't vindictive, it was necessary. Years of manipulation don't unravel with apologies. They unravel with exposure. Later that night, a final message came through. "You don't understand what you're starting." I placed the phone face down and turned off the light. I understood exactly what I was starting. I was starting the end of a story he thought he controlled. And in the quiet of that room, surrounded by proof he never expected me to find, one truth settled fully into my bones. The safe hadn't just held secrets, it had held the moment my life stopped being managed by someone else. And that kind of freedom doesn't make noise when it arrives. It just changes everything. The day he realized control had slipped from his hands, he showed up angry. Not the loud kind, not the explosive kind. This was sharper, focused, the kind of anger that believes it still has leverage if it just chooses the right words. I saw his car pull up from the living room window. I didn't move. I didn't rush to hide anything. The house was already stripped of what mattered. Evidence secured, copies distributed, steps taken. There was nothing left for him to intimidate out of me. He knocked once, hard. I opened the door calmly. "You froze my accounts," he said, skipping hello, skipping pretense. I tilted my head slightly. "The court did that." His mouth tightened. "You went behind my back." I almost laughed at the irony. "You built an entire financial life behind mine," I replied. "I just opened a door." He stepped inside without asking, pacing like a man trying to reassert gravity. "You have no idea how complicated this is. You're going to make a mess you can't clean up." I closed the door behind him slowly, deliberately. "I've already cleaned it up," I said. You just didn't notice." He stopped pacing, looked at me carefully, really looked. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression, not fear yet, but recalculation. "What exactly do you think you found?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked past him to the hallway closet. I opened the door, moved the coats aside, and pressed my palm flat against the wall. The safe was still there, untouched. His breath hitched so slightly most people would have missed it. "You told me it held nothing important," I said. "You were wrong." The silence that followed was heavy, charged, final. "That safe was private," he said sharply. "You had no right." "You forged my signature," I interrupted. "You diverted joint investments. You hid assets while telling me we were struggling. Privacy doesn't apply when fraud does." His face hardened. "You're overreacting." "No," I said. "I'm responding accurately." That's when his tone changed. Pleading crept in. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "We can handle this between us. Lawyers will bleed you dry. You don't want this public." I met his gaze without flinching. "You already made it public. You just didn't know it yet." He took a step closer. "You think people will believe you over me." I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because belief was no longer the currency that mattered. Proof was. He left shortly after that, slamming the door hard enough to shake the frame. I waited until his car disappeared before I sat down on the couch, hands finally trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go. I let it pass. That night, my lawyer called. "They're panicking," she said. "His attorney reached out. They want to negotiate." I closed my eyes. Negotiate what? Damage control. I smiled faintly, not out of satisfaction, but recognition. This was the phase where men like him realized too late that charm doesn't move judges and intimidation doesn't rewrite ledgers. "They're asking what you want," she continued. I thought of the safe, the folders, the notes written in his handwriting never meant for me to see. "I want the truth on record," I said, "and I want everything traced." She paused. "That will open doors he doesn't want opened." "Then he shouldn't have locked them," I replied. After the call, I walked back to the closet and opened the safe one more time, not to look inside, but to confirm something I already knew. This wasn't just evidence, it was a confession he'd written to himself. And soon, very soon, it was going to be read by people who didn't care how convincing he sounded when he spoke. They cared how clearly he documented his own guilt. As I closed the safe and turned off the light, my phone buzzed again. One message: "You've gone too far." I set the phone down and smiled softly. He still thought this was a line I could cross. He didn't understand yet. There was no going back to the version of me who never opened the safe, and the next step would make that painfully clear. The negotiations didn't start with apologies. They never do. They started with offers. His attorney sent the first message 2 days later, carefully worded, politely urgent. It spoke of misunderstandings, privacy concerns, and a desire to resolve matters efficiently. There was no mention of forged signatures, no acknowledgement of hidden accounts, just a quiet request to make things go away. I read it once. Then I forwarded it to my lawyer without comment. She called me an hour later. "They're testing you," she said, "seeing if you'll trade silence for convenience." "I won't," I replied. "I know," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I just needed to confirm. From that point on, everything hardened into process. Forensic accountants expanded their scope. What started as joint investments widened into business accounts I'd never heard of, properties routed through names that didn't exist, shell companies that dissolved and reformed like smoke. Each layer peeled back revealed another decision he'd made deliberately, confidently, assuming no one would ever bother to look closely. He hadn't counted on patience. Meanwhile, he tried a different angle: guilt. He sent a message late one night, long, emotional, strangely theatrical. He wrote about stress, about pressure, about mistakes made trying to protect us. He said he was sorry I felt hurt. I didn't respond. An apology that centers itself isn't an apology, it's a distraction. The next morning, my lawyer sent me an update that made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with gravity. They've identified discrepancies that may trigger criminal review, she said. This is no longer just civil. I sat very still. This was the part I'd known was possible but hadn't named out loud. The moment where consequences stopped being negotiable, where control truly slipped beyond anyone's grip. What happens next? I asked. That depends on how much more they find, she said, and how much he's already destroyed. That afternoon, I went back to the house, not because I needed anything, but because I wanted to stand in the space where all of this had lived quietly for so long. I walked through each room slowly, noticing details I'd overlooked before. The way he'd insisted on handling paperwork, the way he'd discouraged questions with jokes and patience-laced condescension. It all made sense now. I wasn't bad with money, I'd been managed. That realization landed heavy, but it didn't break me. It clarified everything. When I reached the hallway closet, I paused. The safe was still hidden, still silent. I didn't open it this time. I rested my hand against the wall where it lived and let myself feel the weight of the choice I'd made days earlier. Opening that door had changed the trajectory of my life. Closing it again had sealed his. That evening he showed up again, but this time he didn't knock. He called from the driveway. "I need to talk to you. This is getting out of hand." I stood at the window watching him sit in his car, phone pressed to his ear, posture rigid. "It's already handled," I replied calmly. "No, you don't understand what they're digging into." I let the silence stretch just long enough to feel him shift on the other end. "I understand exactly," I said. "That's why I didn't stop them." He swallowed audibly. "You're going to ruin me." I closed my eyes briefly. "You did that yourself," I said. "I just opened the drawer you kept it in." I hung up before he could respond. My hands didn't shake this time. That night, my lawyer emailed again, short, direct. "They're escalating." I stared at the screen, heart steady. Escalation meant exposure. Exposure meant there was no version of this where he talked his way out. And as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, one truth followed me into the dark. The safe hadn't just contained proof of what he'd done, it contained proof of who he was. And tomorrow, people with power were going to start reading it line by line. The first official notice arrived by certified mail. I recognized the envelope before I opened it. The weight of it, the formality, the way it demanded attention without emotion. This wasn't him reaching out. This wasn't negotiation. This was the system responding to evidence. I sat at the kitchen table and read every word carefully. Asset freezes expanded, additional accounts flagged, formal inquiries initiated. No adjectives, no opinions, just actions. Somewhere across town, he was learning what it felt like to lose access to things he thought were permanently his. Credit lines tightening, transfers denied, property suddenly under review, the infrastructure he'd built to protect himself with collapsing under scrutiny he'd never imagined facing. He didn't call that day. That silence told me more than any outburst could have. By midweek, the forensic accountants had mapped nearly everything. They walked me through it in a meeting that felt surreal, watching strangers explain my own marriage back to me through charts and flow diagrams, lines branching out, circling back, disappearing into shell companies and re-emerging as personal expenditures. This wasn't opportunistic, one of them said. This was long-term. I nodded. I know. Hearing it confirmed out loud didn't hurt the way I expected. It validated something I'd felt for years, but never trusted myself enough to say. The confusion I lived with wasn't accidental. It was manufactured. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. His attorney requested another conversation. This time, the tone had shifted. Gone were the suggestions of misunderstanding. In their place, concern, urgency, a quiet acknowledgement that the ground was no longer stable. They're asking if you're open to a settlement, a significant one, my lawyer said. Does it include full disclosure? Yes. And accountability on record? She paused. That's what they're trying to avoid. Then no, I said. This wasn't about maximizing payout. It was about ending a pattern. That night, I dreamed of the safe, not as a threat, but as a door I'd already walked through. I woke up calm, grounded, aware of something new settling into place. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was directing. 2 days later, news reached me through my lawyer's careful tone. They've referred part of this to criminal review, she said. It doesn't mean charges yet, but it means attention. I closed my eyes slowly. This was the line people like him never believe exists, the point where cleverness stops being admired and starts being examined. He finally called that evening. His voice was different now, quieter, less certain. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. I looked out the window, watching the sky darken. Neither did I replied. That's why I let the truth handle it. There was a long pause. I trusted you, he finally said. I felt something settle in my chest, not pain, not guilt, but clarity. You trusted that I wouldn't look. That's not the same thing. He didn't argue. We hung up without resolution, without closure, without promises, and for the first time I understood something deeply. Closure doesn't come from conversations with people who benefit from confusion. It comes from clarity. As I shut down the house for the night, I walked past the hallway closet again. I didn't stop this time. I didn't need to. The safe had already done its job. Tomorrow, the process would continue, broader, deeper, more public than he ever imagined, and the farther it went, the clearer it became. The man who once believed he controlled every outcome had left behind a paper trail so thorough it would outlive every excuse he tried to make, and I was no longer afraid where that trail led. By the time the subpoenas went out, his confidence had completely evaporated. I didn't see it firsthand, not at first. I heard it through careful phrasing, through pauses in my lawyer's voice, through the way professionals choose their words when they know the ground has shifted under someone else's feet. Several institutions are cooperating, she told me, more than we expected. That sentence carried weight. Institutions don't cooperate out of kindness. They cooperate when records align too neatly to ignore, when numbers tell the same story from too many angles, when pretending not to notice becomes a liability. At home, the house finally felt like mine. Not because his things were gone, they'd been gone for weeks, but because the energy had changed, the constant low hum of being managed, corrected, second-guessed had lifted. I rearranged furniture, opened windows, let light into rooms I'd kept dim for years without realizing why. That's when I understood how deeply control embeds itself into everyday life. You don't notice it while it's happening. You notice it when it's gone. His attorney reached out again, this time requesting mediation to avoid unnecessary exposure. The phrase almost made me smile. Exposure was no longer unnecessary. It was inevitable. "We'll attend," my lawyer said after I forwarded the message, "but we won't compromise facts." Mediation was scheduled for the following week. I spent the days leading up to it reviewing nothing. No documents, no timelines. I already knew them. Instead, I focused on myself. Long walks, quiet mornings, meals eaten without rushing. This wasn't avoidance, it was grounding. I needed to walk into that room clear, not braced. The night before mediation, he sent one last message. "I never meant for this to hurt you." I stared at it for a long time before typing back a single sentence. Intent doesn't erase impact. Then I turned my phone off. The mediation room was smaller than I expected, neutral, designed to feel safe, reasonable, forgettable. He was already seated when I arrived, posture stiff, hands folded too tightly together. He didn't meet my eyes. For the first time, he looked like a man watching a version of his life slip past him without invitation. The mediator spoke. Ground rules, process, neutrality, all the usual language meant to soften hard truths. Then the documents came out. Not all of them, just enough. Flash drive summaries, transaction charts, signature comparisons. I didn't speak much. I didn't need to. Every time his attorney tried to frame something as confusion or oversight, my lawyer calmly slid another page forward. Dates, patterns, notes. The room grew quieter with each document revealed. When it was his turn to speak, he tried to explain, to contextualize, to minimize. His voice wavered in places he hadn't expected it to. He was used to talking his way through discomfort, not being asked to account for years of deliberate planning. At one point, he looked at me directly. "I never thought you'd find it," he said. "The safe." I met his gaze evenly. "You never thought I'd look." That was the moment mediation stopped being about compromise, because compromise requires two people who believe the truth is flexible. This truth wasn't. The session ended without agreement. Outside, my lawyer turned to me. "They're running out of room." I nodded. I could feel it too, not as excitement, not as victory, but as momentum, the kind that builds when systems take over and personal influence no longer matters. That night, as I drove home under a darkening sky, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. The message that followed was short, strained, unfamiliar. "They're talking about charges." I sat in the car for a long moment after listening, the engine idling softly. The word hung in the air. Charges, not as revenge, not as justice, but as consequence. The safe had held secrets, but it had also held something else, a line he never expected to cross. And tomorrow, that line was going to be drawn in ink, not pencil, permanent, unmovable, and finally, out of my hands. Once the word charges entered the conversation, everything changed. Not in the loud, dramatic way movies portray, but in the quiet tightening of systems that no longer ask permission. Deadlines shortened, emails came faster, meetings multiplied. The pace shifted from cautious to urgent, and I could feel the machinery of accountability moving forward without hesitation. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about records. The investigators requested original copies, then secondary confirmations, then third-party verification. Each request came with calm professionalism, the kind that doesn't threaten, it assumes cooperation because resistance would be pointless. I handed everything over without comment. The safe's contents became exhibits, flash drives duplicated, handwritten notes analyzed, signature comparisons confirmed what I'd known the moment I saw them. My name used like a weapon, my trust treated as leverage. One of the investigators looked at me carefully during an interview. "Did you ever suspect this?" he asked. I considered the question. "I suspected something was wrong," I said. "I just didn't know how wrong." He nodded, like that was an answer he'd heard before. By the end of the week, assets were officially seized, not frozen, not paused, but taken out of circulation entirely. Properties locked, accounts closed, the scaffolding of his hidden life dismantled piece by piece. He didn't contact me. Not once. That silence felt different from the others. It wasn't arrogance this time, it was collapse. At home, I started doing things I'd postponed for years, small things, repainting a wall, replacing furniture he'd chosen, clearing out drawers filled with items I'd never used because they weren't necessary. The house began to breathe differently. One afternoon, my lawyer called with a tone I hadn't heard before, measured but firm. "They're moving forward," she said. "Formal charges are being prepared." I closed my eyes slowly. There it was, the moment everyone thinks they want until it actually arrives. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like a long-held breath finally released. "What happens now?" I asked. "You wait, and you keep living." So I did. I paid off debts I hadn't known existed until weeks earlier, balances he'd hidden while insisting we were barely scraping by. I closed accounts that carried his fingerprints. I opened new ones in my name alone, choosing clarity over convenience. Every decision felt lighter. That night, I sat in the hallway outside the closet where the safe still lived, unopened, untouched since the last time. I didn't need to look inside again. The contents were already elsewhere, on desks, in files, in rooms where truth doesn't bend. I rested my back against the wall and thought about how close I'd come to never knowing any of this, how easily I could have accepted his narrative and moved on confused, diminished, carrying guilt that was never mine. Instead, I'd opened a door, not because I was suspicious, because I finally trusted my instincts. My phone buzzed near midnight, a message from an unknown number. "I never thought you'd do this." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to explain. Tomorrow, the world would start learning what arrogance always forgets, that secrecy only works when no one dares to look closely. And I had looked, carefully, completely, and without fear. Courtrooms have a sound of their own. Not loud, not dramatic, just the steady murmur of systems doing what they were built to do. Paper shuffling, low voices conferring, the quiet finality of doors closing behind decisions that can't be undone. I sat in the second row, hands folded in my lap, spine straight. I wasn't nervous, I wasn't eager, I was present. He entered from the side door with his attorney, posture stiff, expression carefully neutral. He didn't look at me, not once, not when he sat, not when the judge entered, not when his name was called. Avoidance is its own confession. The charges were read clinically: financial fraud, forgery, misappropriation of joint assets, each count tied back to documentation pulled directly from the safe. The handwriting analysis, the transaction trails, the corroboration from institutions that no longer pretended not to see. I watched his face change, not dramatically, not suddenly, but in increments. Each line item stripped away another layer of the man who once believed confidence could carry him through anything. When his attorney spoke, the arguments were restrained, careful, designed to limit damage rather than deny reality. There was no room left for storytelling. Facts had filled the room completely. At one point, the judge paused and looked directly at him. "These records are unusually thorough," she said. "Did you maintain them yourself?" He hesitated, just long enough. "Yes," he answered quietly. That admission landed heavier than anything else. He had kept his own ledger, not out of fear, but out of pride. The proceedings recessed briefly, and I stepped into the hallway alone. The walls were plain, the air too cool. I leaned against the window and breathed slowly, grounding myself in the ordinariness of the moment. This wasn't revenge. This was consequence. When the session resumed, rulings followed swiftly. Assets formally seized, properties reassigned, additional reviews authorized. His financial reach narrowed into something manageable, containable, accountable. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply listened. When it was over, my lawyer touched my arm lightly. "You did everything right," she said. I nodded, not because I needed affirmation, but because I understood the truth of it. Outside the courthouse, the sun was brighter than expected. Life moved on around us, cars passing, people talking, coffee being carried in paper cups. The world hadn't paused for his downfall. It rarely does. My phone buzzed once as I walked to my car, a message from him, sent but unsent, hovering in the draft folder of my mind without ever reaching me. I didn't wonder what it said. Some explanations arrived too late to matter. That evening, back home, I walked through the rooms again, this time not cataloging memories or losses, but possibilities. I opened windows, let air move freely. I rearranged a bookshelf, threw out a stack of papers that no longer served any purpose. The house no longer felt like a place where secrets lived. It felt like a place where I did. Before going to bed, I stood once more in front of the hallway closet. I opened it, moved the coats aside, looked at the outline where the safe sat hidden behind drywall. Tomorrow, contractors would come to remove it. I placed my palm against the wall one last time. That safe held evidence. It had held lies. It had held years of manipulation. But it also held the moment everything changed. And as I turned off the light and walked away, one thought stayed with me. Steady, unshakable, earned. Some people build their downfall carefully, believing no one will ever look closely enough to see it. They forget that silence doesn't mean blindness. Sometimes it just means someone is gathering the truth. And soon, that truth would finish what it started. After the courtroom, life didn't explode into something new. It narrowed. And in that narrowing, it became clearer than it had ever been. The legal process moved into a quieter phase, hearings scheduled months out, formal notices mailed instead of delivered by hand, decisions recorded in ink rather than argued aloud. The drama was over. What remained was structure, consequence stretched across time instead of moments. I adjusted to the stillness slowly. Mornings became mine again. No tension humming under the surface, no second guessing whether a question would be dismissed or twisted. I drank my coffee without rushing. I slept deeper than I had in years. The contractors came and removed the safe 3 days later. I watched as they cut into the wall, exposed the steel, unbolted it, and carried it out like it was nothing more than debris. Dust coated the floor. The outline remained, a rectangular scar where secrets had lived. I didn't ask them to patch it right away. I wanted to see it. The absence mattered. My lawyer called that afternoon to update me on the next steps: asset liquidation timelines, debt reconciliation, final disclosures. She spoke calmly, efficiently, like someone who knew the end of this story was already written. "He's no longer contesting the records," she said. "That chapter is closed." I felt something loosen in my chest. At night, I began going through my own paperwork, not evidence, not legal files, but my life. Old journals, notes I'd written when I couldn't sleep, lists of things I'd postponed because they didn't seem practical or important enough. I realized how small I had made my own wants to accommodate someone else's certainty. That realization didn't hurt anymore. It instructed. I paid off the last of the hidden debts within weeks. Watching the balances disappear felt surreal, not because of the money, but because of the clarity. Each payment was a correction, not a sacrifice. Each closure was a reclaiming. He sent one final message through his attorney, a request. He wanted to speak to me privately for closure. I declined. Closure is not something you hand to someone who benefited from confusion. It's something you give yourself when you stop explaining. Instead, I went to the hardware store and picked out paint, a warm, clean white. When I rolled it over the place where the safe had been, I felt something settle completely. Not relief, not triumph, completion. That night I stood in the hallway looking at the wall, smooth now, unremarkable, silent. Anyone walking past it would never know what had once been hidden there. And that felt right, because my future didn't need a monument to betrayal. It needed space. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, my phone buzzed with an alert. Another legal update, another step finalized, another door quietly closing behind me. I didn't open it right away. I already knew where this was going. But even with most of the battle behind me, I understood something important. The final victory wouldn't come from court orders or seized assets. It would come from the moment I stopped defining my life by what I survived and started shaping it around what I deserved. And that moment was closer than I thought.
The quiet that followed surprised me more than the chaos ever did. Not the awkward quiet of waiting or the heavy quiet of grief, but the clean kind, the kind that settles in once something toxic has finally been removed and the body doesn't yet know how to exist without it. I moved through my days without bracing myself anymore. No rehearsed conversations in my head, no mental spreadsheets tracking lies versus truth, no flinch when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. The vigilance I'd lived with for years began to loosen, muscle by muscle, thought by thought. It felt unfamiliar, almost irresponsible. That's when I realized how deeply I'd been conditioned to expect disruption. The legal process continued quietly in the background, like construction behind closed doors. Notices arrived, confirmations followed, deadlines passed without drama. Each update felt less urgent than the last, not because it didn't matter, but because I'd already reclaimed what mattered most, my agency. One afternoon, while organizing a bookshelf, I found an old notebook from years earlier. I flipped it open and saw lists written in my own handwriting, things I wanted to do someday, places I wanted to visit, classes I wanted to take, questions I wanted answers to. I'd stopped writing in it abruptly. I knew why. That was around the time he'd started telling me things were too risky, too expensive, not realistic. Around the time I'd learned to defer instead of decide. I sat down on the floor and read every page slowly. Then I grabbed a pen. I didn't rewrite the list. I added dates. That evening, my lawyer called with what she called the final procedural update. The tone told me everything before the words did. "This is it," she said. "There's nothing left unresolved." I closed my eyes, letting that land fully. Nothing left unresolved. No more loose ends, no more hidden doors, no more waiting for truth to surface. After the call, I made myself dinner and ate it at the table instead of the couch, a small habit I had abandoned years ago without noticing. I lit a candle, not for ambiance, for intention. I thought about how easily I could have missed the safe, how close I'd come to leaving the house exactly as it was, untouched, unquestioned. How many women live entire lifetimes carrying confusion that isn't theirs because someone else insisted on managing the narrative? I didn't feel lucky. I felt awake. Later that night, I stood in the hallway again, looking at the wall where the safe had once been. Smooth now, clean, ordinary. If I hadn't known what it held, I would have walked past it without a second glance. That was the lesson. The most dangerous things are often the ones hidden in plain sight, wrapped in reassurance, sealed with confidence, guarded by dismissal. I hadn't been foolish. I'd been trusting. And now I was neither naive nor hardened. I was discerning. As I turned off the lights and headed toward my bedroom, my phone buzzed once more. Not a legal update, not a message from him. A calendar reminder, something I'd scheduled weeks earlier. New beginning. I smiled softly and stepped into the dark, because tomorrow wouldn't be about what I uncovered. It would be about what I built next. And the final chapter, the one that truly mattered, was about to begin. The morning everything finally ended, I woke up without checking my phone. No alerts, no updates, no messages waiting to pull me back into a story that was already finished. Sunlight crept through the curtains, soft and unhurried, and for the first time in a long time, I let myself stay still. I didn't need confirmation anymore. The case was closed, assets redistributed, debts resolved, records sealed. The systems had done what systems do when presented with truth that can't be ignored. The man who once believed he'd secured his future through secrecy had documented his own undoing with precision. I didn't celebrate. I cleaned. I opened every window and let fresh air move through the house. I boxed up the last items that didn't belong to me anymore, not because they hurt, but because they were finished teaching me whatever lesson they had come to deliver. I made space without rushing, without nostalgia tugging at my hands. In the afternoon, I took a walk around the neighborhood. Neighbors waved, dogs barked, life continued exactly as it always had, and that continuity felt grounding. My life hadn't exploded into something dramatic, it had settled into something honest. That evening, I sat at the table and wrote one final list, not of evidence, not of tasks, but of truths. I wrote about trusting instincts, about silence that listens instead of hides, about preparation being louder than confrontation, about freedom arriving not as a gift, but as a consequence of choosing clarity over comfort. I folded the paper and placed it in a drawer I could open any time I forgot who I'd become. Before bed, I stood once more in the hallway where the safe had once lived. The wall was smooth now, freshly painted, unremarkable. No trace of what it had held, no marker of what had been hidden there for years. And that felt right, because my life didn't need a reminder of betrayal to stay strong. It needed honesty to stay open. The safe he never opened didn't just hold secrets. It held the moment I stopped being managed and started being free. If you learned something new from my life story, please like this video, subscribe to join our community for more stories like mine, and comment down below where you're watching this video from. I'd truly love to know.